We're so screwed with the Supreme Court, y'all. I swear to goodness. We covered this, oh yeah, good news recently. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember exactly what the context was where we covered it, but Biden had tried to update, like the Biden administration tried to update Title IX. Title IX is the anti-discrimination protection for schools, you know? So if we had situations like Next Benedict in Oklahoma, there was this, push to do a Title IX investigation because there had already been, warning signs that they had been bullied and stuff prior to the fight that ended up resulting in their death. So Biden's administration was basically like, yeah, we're just going to kind of expand Title IX to include protections against, to protect gender identity and sexual orientation, even though there are court cases already. In fact, the Supreme Court has done court cases in the past 5 to 6 years saying that, yes, gender identity and sexual orientation are protected under the concept of sex discrimination. If you wouldn't punish a woman for being married to a man, but you would punish a man for being married to a man, that is covered under sex discrimination. Or if you would not punish a cisgender woman for wearing a dress, but you are punishing a transgender woman for wearing a dress because she was assigned male at birth, that is sex discrimination under, in that case, it was a workplace discrimination. But Title IX has to do with schools, right? So there have already been court cases that have determined that sex discrimination includes these other categories. And the Biden administration was like, we're just going to make this official. We're just not going to leave this up to court interpretation. And then the Supreme Court comes in and here they go saying they reject the Biden administration's request to enforce new civil rights protections for LGBTQ plus students. So these Title IX things, they're just like, well, we're not going to do them. On Friday this week, they turned down a request from the Biden admin to enforce parts of a new federal rule meant to protect LGBTQ plus and pregnant students from discrimination in 10 states where the rule was put on hold by federal judges. The court announced this decision in an unsigned order that drew a partial dissent from the court's 3 liberals and conservative Justice Neil Gorsuch. The Supreme Court's order is the latest blow to the Biden admin on this issue, which has suffered a series of setbacks with federal courts blocking a rule that was intended to protect transgender students. Much of the rule remains blocked in about half the nation. This sweeping rule issued in April clarified that Title IX's ban on sex discrimination in schools covers these other things: gender identity, sexual orientation, and pregnancy or related conditions. Other provisions within Title IX address protections for pregnant and postpartum students, including access to lactation spaces and prohibitions on retaliation. Compliance with Title IX, which was enacted in 1972, is required for schools that receive federal aid. So it's basically like any public school, I'm pretty sure. Pretty much any public school. All 9 justices agreed to block the Biden administration's clarification of sex discrimination. Why? When most of these justices were on the court when they did the recent employment discrimination case, those who dissented would have allowed other less contested provisions of the new rule to take effect in the 10 states at issue. Sonia Sotomayor said blocking enforcement of the entire rule appears to go beyond what was necessary. Pointing to provisions of the rule that deal with pregnancy discrimination or pre-employment inquiries about a candidate's marital status, Sotomayor said that the states, quote, offer nothing to justify preventing the government from enforcing those parts of the rule. But the court's brief said that it was the government's burden to demonstrate that those provisions could be separated from the ones that were challenged, and, quote, on this limited record, the government has not provided this court a sufficient basis to disturb the lower court's interim conclusions. So, yeah, it's basically the entire new rule will remain on hold in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Virginia, West Virginia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, and Ohio. The rule is also blocked in 16 states as part of other lawsuits. So basically, they're just letting this... We're just going to continue to live in an increasingly divided nation where your rights are highly dependent on your zip code. If the Supreme Court is like, yeah, well, we've decided we're not going to back the executive branch on this one, we're just going to let the lower courts fight it out. Does that mean that these cases are going to have to continue to get appealed up until they reach the Supreme Court, at which time the Supreme Court is probably not going to back the executive branch on this? Yeah, I love the court of high priests making the world a worse place. At first, I thought that that was kind of silly, and I just more and more I'm on board with this idea that these are just, yeah, they're like priests or wizards or something that have been appointed to maintain a very specific status quo and to like continue stripping us of rights and protections. Mitternacht and I are here to ask you to hit like on the video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe. Click the bell if you feel like it. You don't have to though. Feel free to check out the other links in the description because I sell merch like this cute tank top. I'm running a GoFundMe to try to move 2,000 miles across the country to a place where I have rights. And I have a Patreon with, he's smashing his face against my face. Yeah, there's like two separate lawsuits brought by Republican attorneys general claiming that 3 specific provisions of the new rule are unlawful. The provision that expands the scope of sex, a provision that would bar schools from disallowing trans students from using bathrooms or locker rooms consistent with their gender, and a provision clarifying that the law's prohibition on, quote, hostile environment harassment could implicate anti-trans conduct. No, anti-trans conduct is not an hostile environment. The Republicans have decided that being anti-trans and causing trans people distress is not a hostile environment. I'm not going to go so far as to say the Supreme Court should not exist. I mean, within the current set of things, like, the purpose of them is supposed to be to interpret the law. And so I don't think it's bad necessarily to have a body that interprets the law and determines whether things are in line with, you know, the fundamental rules of the Constitution. But the way in which the Supreme Court exists is obviously not functional right now. They have no term limits. They seem to be, they're completely held to a different standard as far as bribes go, basically. Like, they're allowed to take bribes effectively. Like, certainly things about the Supreme Court are fundamentally wrong. And of course, the whole system is screwed up. So, you know, if we were to say, oh, they're good at their jobs anyway, that includes being good at a job that, you know, is fundamentally flawed in some ways, looking at the whole system. And yeah, I agree that there should be more justices. At this point, there are so many people in this country, like, I feel like it should be more representative. Yeah, it is super silly that the Supreme Court has no enforceable ethics code. But yeah, things are not looking good with this Supreme Court. And, you know, even if Biden were to try to expand the court at this point, I think we all know that even if one of them died today, they're not going to let Biden put someone in. They blocked Obama for like 2 years, and then they shoved through 3 Trump appointees. Like, insane. Absolutely crazy. Harris would have to be the one to expand the court. Yeah, I think that she would also probably face a lot of opposition. It's crazy that the part of this that's, I think, the most surprising to me is that the parts which protected pregnant students from discrimination are also like, they're just like, no, we're not going to enforce that part. We're not going to agree that sex discrimination includes discrimination against pregnant people. But isn't that the case in like housing and employment? Like, you can't discriminate against a pregnant person in employment. I mean, people still do. You know, obviously they can come up with any reason just saying, oh, well, we didn't hire you because it wouldn't be a good fit. But like, legally speaking, you're not supposed to discriminate against, you can't like fire someone for being pregnant. It's like, that's a great way to pay out a nice fat sum. I think term limits is a better solution than expanding the court, because otherwise each side will just keep expanding it. Yeah, that's fair, I guess, on some level, but also, like, again, from a population standpoint, we have 9 justices representing like 300 million people. Like, it is like 300 million. Is that just the adults population of the United States? Yeah, okay, 333 million as of 2022. Yeah, like, I do think that maybe both of those things, like, if the court should be expanded so that they're representing a smaller total chunk of the population in their decisions, but also term limits would probably help. There's an argument to be made for expanding the court to 12, tying the number of justices to the number of Circuit Court of Appeals. Yeah, I think that's fair. When the Supreme Court was set to 9, that was because of the district thing. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so like we have each state has its own Supreme Court, but then if the case still needs to be adjudicated, there's the district courts, which, it's like, okay, these 4 states are one district or circuit. Yeah. So that makes sense. Yeah, there could be an argument to expand it to 13 so that there's one justice for each circuit appeals court. And yeah, like Biden just recommended 18-year term limits. That would immediately knock out 3 conservative justices. Would that our rights weren't so dependent on this precarious house of cards. It just feels like things can dramatically change at any time. But with this, as with many things, we'll just have to see how these lower courts do it, and we're probably going to end up in a situation where, well, I guess Title IX is federal, so yeah, it's basically like these lower courts need to work their way. These lower cases need to work their way, and if they get to the Supreme Court, then we'll get a proper Supreme Court decision as to whether sex discrimination includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and pregnancy status. Not a fun time. I'm not having fun anymore. Thank you so much to all my patrons, but especially Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvog, Jack, Amanda B., Michelle Frateroli, Michelle Winter, Wellington Marcus, Danielle McDonald, DZXN, Ella V. Nobody, Pastel Infinity, Suzanne Maynard, Nova, Desi Quiche, Celeste, Athiette, Jamie Jam, Sojo, Bean, Kevin Young, Mr. Atheist, Liam Hodgson, Elizabeth Bartell, and Jericho.